This is the Caliginous Chronicles, stories by Jacob Hopkins, narrated by EA Hopkins, audio production by Luke Rodriguez. A new host. How do you know that you are in fact you? This was the question that had been running through Charlotte's mind for the last 3 weeks. It wasn't some sort of philosophical crisis either. She was truly concerned that she might not be alone in her own body. It started innocently enough, twitches in her eyes and corners of her mouth. Then her fine motor skills were slightly off. Eating with her dominant right hand became almost impossible, while suddenly she was able to use her left. Charlotte couldn't afford a visit to the doctor to get to the root of the problem, so she did what all people do that are struggling financially. She ignored it. But in Charlotte's case, she could only ignore for so long. Eventually, she would find herself sleepwalking through her apartment. It was concerning, but it turned to downright terror when she caught herself opening her front door, knife in hand. What had she intended to do? She could not say. It was after a similar incident that Charlotte went to the bathroom and stared at her reflection. Who was she? What was happening to her? She gazed intently into the reflection of her eyes, searching for an answer. And then something moved. Not behind her. Not in her peripheral vision. In her. The white of her eye. For a fleeting moment, she had seen what looked like a strange worm-like creature. Charlotte's heart rate skyrocketed. Her breathing quickened. Desperately, she pulled at the skin around her eye, searching for the interloper. She wanted to find it. And at the same time hoped to come up empty-handed. What would she do if she did find it? It must have been nothing, she was beginning to convince herself. The last few weeks had been incredibly stressful. She had seen one of those floaters that people talk about seeing in their eyes. With everything that had been happening, she had worked herself up over nothing. Then she saw 2 worm-like creatures swim to the surface of her eyeball and disappear. Charlotte gasped in horror. Backing away from the sink and mirror, she was unable to look away from her own visage of shock. Her face began to tingle. Instinctually, she rubbed her cheeks, trying to relieve this new sensation. The action was met with a squishing sound. She rushed back to the mirror. There was no movement in her eyes, but she could swear that there was some sort of sound in her skull. It was familiar. Charlotte tried to place it. Was it a squishing? Not exactly, but it was familiar. Shutting her eyes tight, she focused on the noise. Munching. It was the sound of something munching. Charlotte dropped to the bathroom floor. She looked at her body as if it was a thing of utter disgust. Something was inside her, and it was eating her. Of this she was convinced. Crawling on hands and knees, Charlotte made her way into her bedroom to retrieve her phone. She no longer cared about the price tag on the medical bills. She wanted whatever was inside her out. Her hand dialed 911 and stopped. The thumb of her right hand hovered above the one, but try as she might, Charlotte couldn't force it down. A battle of wills was taking place, and Charlotte's body was the battlefield. Time seemingly stood still as Charlotte battled herself. Eventually, sweat beaded her body as she threw every ounce of energy she could muster into pressing a single button on her phone. The strain became so intense that her stomach began to churn. It began to gurgle, and the sensation of being at sea started. Soon it was all-encompassing. With a sharp spasm, the meager contents of her stomach heaved forward. Dropping the phone during her purge, Charlotte didn't immediately notice the movement in her vomit. Long, thin, almost translucent worms wriggled like fish out of water. The sight mortified Charlotte. Something was indeed inside of her, and she had no idea what damage it was doing. Then something worse happened. She could feel it taking over. Charlotte fought with all her might, but she found herself a prisoner inside her own flesh. Crawling towards the vomitous, wriggling mass, Charlotte felt her mouth open wide and her tongue stuck out. All she could do was cry as she lapped the parasites back into her body. Once the revolting deed was done, Charlotte could feel control return. She wasn't sure for how long. Could the thing read her mind? Would it be one step ahead? There was only one way to find out. Darting into the bathroom, she ripped open the medicine cabinet as swiftly as she could. Charlotte twisted off the lid to the hydrogen peroxide and began to chug. If the parasite could read her mind, it clearly had little understanding of hydrogen peroxide. But then neither did Charlotte. She knew it wasn't meant to be ingested, but she really had no idea of what the consequences might be. As the bubbles built inside of her gut, she had a good idea of what was next. This time, she made sure to retch the intruders into the toilet. Once again, if it could read her thoughts, it had no concept of what a toilet was. She flushed as fast as she could, happily watching the worms swirl into oblivion. Then the pain swam over her. The parasite may not understand hydrogen peroxide or toilets, but clearly could sense that it had lost part of its brood. It assailed every part of her. Charlotte's skin crawled, in some cases, literally. Worms visible right underneath the surface. Racing into the kitchen, Charlotte grabbed her chef's knife and began slicing away at any movement she saw on her body. She was quickly slick with blood, but she couldn't feel the pain. All of her focus was on ridding herself of this unwelcomed organism, slice after slice, Charlotte hacked at arms and legs. A maniacal laugh escaped her lips when the first worm wriggled free from an open gash. Soon, others followed. Smiling, Charlotte felt she was winning the battle. Now time to win the war. Lifting her shirt, she ran her empty hand across her belly, feeling for movement. They were there. She was sure of it. Some far-off part of her mind screamed that this was madness. There was time to stop this. Flee to the hospital. Someone would see her on the street and call for help, but that voice was shouted down. She was committed. She would not be an unwilling host. The blade dug into her soft flesh. The sharp sting caught her by surprise, but it did not shake her resolve. Gripping the blood-slicked handle with both hands, Charlotte pulled the knife across her stomach. As her intestines began to poke out, she expected to be mortified. Instead, she found herself in a state of intrigue. So that's what they looked like. Pain came in waves. She was getting lightheaded as well. Perhaps shock was setting in. If that was the case, she needed to hurry. Reaching inside the self-inflicted wound, Charlotte began pulling her intestines out hand over hand. The worms were there. She was sure of it. Blood pooled around her. The amount was unexpected. Was it getting colder in here? Suddenly, she was tired. So tired. She just needed to lie down for just a moment. Then back to business. Absent-mindedly, Charlotte tried to put her organs back inside their proper cavity, the same way a child might shove their toys into a closet. Her vision blurred. Dying. That was the last thought that crossed Charlotte's mind. I'm dying. But at least I'm me, she thought. The last sensation she would feel would be worms escaping her failing body. A new host was needed.
If you'd like to support our podcast, please visit patreon.com/Caliginous Chronicles. We include perks such as early access to episodes, digital copies of the stories, and exclusive behind-the-scenes content where we discuss the various aspects of putting together each episode of the Caliginous Chronicles.